Today we're going to draw the second of our 5 forms for the form drawing project. So after the Rubik's Cube comes the soda can. And so the soda can is going to focus on our cylinder shape. So what we're going to look at, we're going to see what type of shape this soda can could fit into. And that is going to be a rectangle. So we can see how the soda can and the cylindrical shape fits within this perfect rectangle, but let's look at some of the curves that make up this can. So at the very top you have a slight arcing upward curve. Below this you have another curve that is parallel. It has the same bend to it, and it's just slightly below that very top green line. Let's look at the bottom. The bottom has a curved line that bends down. It's about the same width as the 2 green lines up above that make the lip of the can. Now above this bottom green line is another curved line that has the same curve to it. It's going to be parallel with the line below it, but it's going to be wider. So it's just as wide as that rectangle in pink that we're seeing on the screen. Now after we have these, you can see where the sides of the soda can are perfectly straight, they're perfectly vertical, and they're parallel with the edges of the picture. Now there's another line that we're not necessarily going to draw, but it's important to see, and it's this slightly curved line upward at the top of the can. And so what this does, it separates where the can is at its widest and where it starts to narrow toward the lip of the can. Now another thing we're going to practice working with text, and within the word Pepsi we now have 2 teal lines, and essentially these lines are curved, but they're not nearly as curved as the lines above it. So as we move further down, the lines that curve upward are slowly going to flatten out, and then that curve flips, which is why we see the bottom lines curving downward. So there are several objectives we're going to approach with this can. First, you want to draw the soda can as it appears. You're going to use any value technique that you want. If we were trying to draw this realistically, it's mostly composed of tonal shading. However, you can use hatching, cross-hatching, stippling, and tonal, or a combination of several or all. The other objective we're going to approach is the text. So rather than keeping the word Pepsi, you're going to change that into your own brand, and we're going to see that with the drawing demonstration. Next, we're going to add the lines of the table. So you also are going to draw the background and the table, which is mostly tonal shading if you opt to use that value. And so the table, or the surface that is metallic, has 2 curved lines that come out at the bottom of the can. So this drawing should take up the entirety of your paper. So it's going to be a full page drawing. Unlike the Rubik's Cube that was just kind of floating in space on a white piece of paper, you're going to use lots and lots of value with this drawing. So let's look and see how we can draw this. Okay, so let's look and see how we can start this drawing. First thing to note is the space from the top of the picture to the top of the can is larger than the space from the bottom of the can to the bottom of the picture. So that's just one thing to note as you're working with this. And the blue wave of the Pepsi logo is roughly in the middle of this picture plane. The picture plane being the entire surface that the picture takes up. So I'm going to start with just that basic rectangle that we saw in the slideshow. And you want to be aware of how wide this rectangle is. So you don't want it too wide, and you also don't want it too narrow. So we want to try and keep it in proportion with what is seen in the photograph. So as I mentioned, there's a little less space at the bottom than there is at the top of the drawing. And even though we're just sketching out this rectangle, you want to try and get it as symmetrical as possible, because overall it's just going to make it a lot easier when you're drawing this object. And as you're drawing, really work with these sketch lines. So if your rectangle is simply made up of 4 lines and that's it, then I would start over. So you need lots and lots of sketch lines because sketching is really important not only for this drawing but really all of the form drawings that we're going to do in class, as well as future drawings that we'll do in class. So once we have this basic rectangle, the first thing we want to look at is the top silver lip of the can. So this is not quite as wide as the width of the can. So where we have this rectangle, the sides, this is going to be the width of our can. So that these will be the edges of the can. So as we saw in the slideshow, we're going to create a curving line that has a slight bend to it, but we don't want it overly dramatic or overly curved. And one thing you want to note too is, as I'm drawing this, the space here and here need to be really, really close in terms of the same amount of space where the line stops. So as you can see right now, this space is not balanced. So this space is a little more narrow than this one. So I'm just going to carry this line over just a little bit to balance that out. So after we have this top line, we're going to do the second line under the can. And this is going to be parallel, and it's going to run pretty close to that first line that we just did. And so how I'm going to draw my curved lines, I'm going to start on one side and go about halfway. And then on the other side, I'm going to start and then meet where I stopped. So this makes it a little bit easier to kind of balance out the lines and the curves so that they are not only parallel, but for the most part, symmetrical. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and move down to the bottom, and we're going to do the bottom curves. So remember, this bottom curve, the very bottom, is about as wide as what we have up here. So there's a couple different things you can do. If you want to get these completely equal, we can do really, really light sketch lines that are going to run parallel to the edges of our rectangle. So we can do this on both sides. And these will eventually get erased or covered up with value at some point. And so this makes it really easy to do this bottom curve because this already tells us where the start and stop is going to be. Now this bottom curve it has a little bit more of a bend to it than the top curves. It's not much, but it does have a slight difference. So I'm going to use the same technique where I start on one side and go about halfway, and then I'm going to pick it up on the other side. So you can see as I'm sketching, there is a little bit of a difference. So this part kind of dips down a little bit more, where this is has a little bit more of a flat curve to it. So it does have a bit more of a curve, so I can shape this just by doing that, and that balances it out pretty well. So after we get this line in, we're going to do the line above it. And with the line above it, it's going to be parallel, but it is going to be wider. So it's going to span from here to the other side, so the edges of our rectangle. So we're just going to shape that a bit more, try and get it a little more balanced. There we are. Now this next line, the space from this line to the next is a little greater, so it's not quite as narrow as what we see up here. So we want to keep these parallel and running at roughly the same curve. So I'm going to start on one side and then come halfway and connect it to the other. So really getting the habit of sketching really light. Now, right now I'm using my 4B pencil. The HB and the 2H work really well for sketching. I am using the darker pencil though, so you can see it on the screen. So right now this line is starting to curve closer to what that bottom line is. So it has about the same bend to it. It does look like it's coming up a little bit higher on this side, but I also have some thicker sketch lines. So we're just going to erase these so you can see it a little bit better. There we are. Now the next thing we're going to want to do is we obviously are going to draw the sides of the can, but we also need to connect this to this. So what you're seeing in the drawing is that it looks like there's a diagonal, but there's a little bit of a curve to it. So we're going to zoom in real close and then look at how we can approach this. So with this curve, it has very, very small curve to it, and then it comes over here, and then it kind of drops down just a little bit, like that. Alright, so now let's look at the other side. So the other important thing is we want to make sure that these are balanced. So you want to try and get the same curve, even though they're really just mirrored images of one another. But you want that symmetry so they look about the same. Let's look at the top. We have to do the same thing, so we're going to finish this up. We're going to almost put like a parentheses type line on both sides to make that curve, and then this line is at an angle. We could do the same thing over here, just make sure they're about the same angle and about the same length. And then this is going to have a real soft S curve into the sides. So again, we want these to be balanced and essentially match one another. And after that, let's zoom back out. Once we zoom out, we no longer need a few of these lines. So we don't need edges up here, kind of these triangular pieces from our original rectangle, so we will take those away. We don't need these bottom corners anymore either, so we'll take those out. And these lines we're going to keep because we may end up needing those for part of the logo, so we'll revisit that in a second. Now let's look and see where our table is going to be. So what you're seeing in the photo here is this line of the silver surface. It essentially curves and will touch, if we could see through the can, it would touch kind of the bottom part of the red, meaning it would be about here. So just to find the placement of the table, I'm going to just sketch a line that goes across that would touch the bottom, which would be like the red part of the can. And where it intersects with this curve that we just drew, it's then going to curve downward. So it's not going to be real dramatic. It has very little of a bend to it, but it does essentially curve out and down like this. And over here, we can see where it intersects, and it's just going to do the exact same thing. So again, use those sketch lines so you can get it balanced. There we are. So now we have the surface. But let's look at the text now. So the word Pepsi. At first glance, it may look like it goes straight across, but it does have that slight curve to it. So like what we saw in the slideshow, it slightly curves upward. But for the most part, it does look pretty flat. So we're going to approach this in the same manner that you may have approached writing when you were in elementary school. So we're going to do a curved line that's going to be fairly flat across, and then the same thing that we did before. We'll start on the other side and then meet halfway. And these lines are temporary, so we're not going to keep them. They're really just there as kind of a placeholder for the words that we're going to write. Now, we're going to make another line. It's going to be parallel with this. So it's going to have just that slight curve to it. So for the most part, it's going to look pretty flat, but it does need that curved aspect. Okay, so those are looking pretty parallel for the most part. And with the text, the reason we keep these lines is that if you notice in the image here, where this curve of the bottom, it kind of lines up with the red of the Pepsi logo. The text ends right before these lines, or starts and ends right before these lines, and then the upper kind of red wave curve aligns with these two. So with the text, again, you're going to change this to your own brand. It can be anything you want to name it. But the key part is we want this text, all vertical lines that go up and down, they need to stay parallel to the sides. So for example, if I'm doing my last name, if I have the letter P, and then this leg of the P is going to keep parallel, just go straight down. But then the bottom part is going to curve with that curve that we just drew. So this interior part, this is going to be parallel with the side of the can. And if I'm writing my last name, so P-A-Y-N-E, you're probably just thinking I'm going to do the A. But a trick to make sure that it stays pretty centered and balanced is, watch this line. We're going to go ahead and just do the last letter. So we're going to work from start and then finish, and then slowly work our way inward. It'll also help with the letter spacing. So if I'm going to turn the E over here, just going to make a straight line that's parallel with this edge line. And then the top part of the E is going to have a slight bend to it. And then same with the bottom part of the E. Of course, these are going to differ based on whichever word that you have picked for your soda brand. And then this will have a little bit of a curve. And your E will end up like this. And then in a minute, I'll erase that dark line. So next, I'm going to put in my A. So the bottom part of the A needs to follow this line that we just sketched. The top part's going to follow that top line that we sketched. Same thing here, so this is going to have a slight curve to it. You can design whatever font or lettering style you want. And then we'll do the N. So the straight leg of the N needs to be parallel with the sides of the can. The top is just going to curve with those top and bottom lines that we drew. And lastly, we're going to put in the Y. So shorter words are probably going to be a little bit easier, but of course you can use whatever word you would like to name your can or your soda. After we have this, we don't need these lines anymore, so we can take those away. We don't need this anymore, so we can take this away also. And let's look at the logo. So you're welcome to design your own logo for this. I'm just going to follow the Pepsi design simply because it's there. So what happens is this kind of red area down below. We already have these lines that we use to guide the bottom of the can. So we're going to keep those. And they're not going to come all the way up to the lettering. So they're going to stop just a little bit short. So just make sure you stop both of these at the same place. And the next step is we're going to have this curve that dips down. So kind of like what we did with our other curve lines, I'm going to start on one side and go about halfway. And again, any type of curve line is much easier if you're using lots of small sketch lines. It really does make it more accurate because you're shaping it on the fly rather than just sticking with one line and possibly getting the curve incorrect that first time. So just put a little bit more of a curve down below, like that. Now for the blue wave in the middle, the bottom part of that blue wave really follows the curve of this red part that we just did. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just erase a little bit to clean it up. It'll make the bottom part of the blue wave a little bit easier to do. And there's a little space in between, so I'm just going to follow this line that I just sketched out. And do the same thing over here. And for the top part, this curves up just a little bit, and then it dips down slightly, and then it meets on the other side for that point. And then what you're also saying on the Pepsi can is these red lines go up a little bit higher. So I'm just going to sketch those in and kind of connect them so it's a little more accurate. Like this. Now for the top part, it's kind of the same thing. The red area is going to follow these lines, but now we have a top curve. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start here, and this red part, it's almost like a puzzle. It slides in and fits this. So this is going to curve up, and then it curves down just a little, and then it's going to meet over here. And after we have this line, it's just an arc to kind of fill this space. Now, with my can and logo, the space between the logo and this area before the metal lip of the can, it is smaller, but I did make my letters a lot taller than what we're seeing in the picture. So again, you can design your own logo. This is just kind of following the Pepsi template that we're looking at in the picture. Okay, so there's that. So we're going to look at adding value now. Now, one thing to note as you are drawing, and especially once you start working with your value, right now I have all these little smudges around that were caused by my hand. If while you are working, if you have a scrap piece of paper, so I have this paper here, when I'm working on the top lip part of the can, I can take my scrap piece of paper and place it over things that I've already drawn. That way, when I'm drawing, I don't have a bunch of extra graphite on my hand, and my hand, because of the texture and the oils on skin, it can smear out a lot of this detail. So just having a scrap piece of paper, something that's slick, like copy paper or old magazine or something, does work really well. So let's zoom in and see how we're going to draw this. So for the metal part of the can, drawing metal is fairly easy in graphite. It's just really knowing how to do it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with my darkest values first. So I'm using my 4B pencil again. I'm just going to sketch these in. And we've got a little bit of a dark shadow under this lip of the can. And so with pencil, you always want to reserve your brightest highlights for the white of the paper. So there are a few really bright highlights. We have it on the silver table. We have bright highlights that you can see the spotlights on the darker side of the can. And if you look at the Pepsi can, we really want to see this area as just white, like the paper, but it's not. So if you look closely, there are very tiny bright highlights that would be the white of the paper, and then the area around would have a very, very slight shade to it. And so the same goes for this upper part. So we do have some highlights in the picture. Now what I'm going to need to do, I'm going to need to kind of clean this up where I have those sketch lines. So I'm going to use my eraser and kind of get those original lines back. And then I could come in with my pencil and just do a little bit of value. And the rest of the blending I am going to do with my tortillon. So you should have a variety of tortillons in your art kit. Get one that has kind of a fine point to it. And anytime you do tonal shading and that you're blending it, it's going to lighten up just a little bit. So when I'm finished with this, I'm going to come back in with my pencil and kind of darken up the darkest areas. And got some of my highlights just a little gray, so I'm going to try and bring these back out. My eraser. It really is easier if you just kind of leave them alone, but sometimes that isn't always the case. And where it's pretty dark on this side, I'm going to just darken this up just a little bit. And there's a slight kind of highlight at the top that disappeared. So I'm going to erase just a little bit at the top, and then I'm just going to lightly kind of go back in and sketch that original line that was there. Now we're going to do the same thing with the bottom where it is also metal. Now before we start, I'm going to erase a lot of these sketch lines away. Just again to kind of clean it up because there are some highlights on the bottom portion of this. So this is why the HB and the 2H pencil work really well. Again, I'm using the darker pencil just so you can see it a little more clearly. So below we have this curve. It's kind of like a disc shape shadow that pops up on the bottom. And I'm going to make sure to move side to side so that way we're keeping the overall design of our form. So this is pretty dark. And if you notice, there's kind of like a grayer area that also follows this curve. And once I have that stuff in, I go in with my tortillon, just kind of blend this. And again, this is just if you wanted to do tonal shading, you could do hatching, for example, or any type of cross hatching. And where I have those really, really bright values, we want to keep those. So where the bright values are, I'm going to try not to do any shading at all, just so it stays white and kind of bright. So like on this side, it's really, really bright, so we're definitely not going to do any shading in this area. So This part kind of got grayed out a little too much, so we're going to just take the eraser, come back in, erase out some more of these highlights. There's a bright highlight here that kind of disappeared. And maybe blend a little bit more of this. And if you ever need to sharpen or clean your tortillons, sandpaper is really the easiest way to do this. And once again, whenever you use the tortillons, it's going to lighten up some of your darkest areas. So I'm going to come back in and just kind of make these dark areas stand out again. And I'm not even going to use the tortillon again. I'm just going to use my pencil and then just kind of let them be. Now the same technique, we'll zoom out just a little bit, the same technique is going to hold true to the metal on the table. So what you're seeing in the can is there's a really, really dark shadow underneath here. So we want to make sure that that stands out. And what we're also seeing on the table is the source of our light. So we see the shadow, and the shadow is falling this way. So it kind of starts over here, and then it has an angle to it. And it's diffused, meaning there are multiple shadows. They're kind of just in like different strengths. And we have kind of the shadow that's starting here. So again, I'm just really starting with my darkest areas. And then I can use my tortillons. And we can tell that this object is curved, the table surface. So with your pencil marks and how you're laying down your pencil, you can see that I'm kind of curving them slightly this way. And I probably should have curved these just a little bit more. So I'll start doing that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to get all these pencil marks down. And then I'm going to come back in with my tortillon and maybe soften these up because this is a metallic surface, so it's going to look pretty shiny and smooth, but if you look at the photo, there are some like little scratches and nicks that I assume were maybe in the metal that just got reflected because there was lots of light showing. So the more detail you include, really the better your drawing, the better it's going to look. And we'll do one last kind of dark area. Then we can come in with the tortillon, and even with my tortillon, I'm going to want to keep it in this kind of like curving direction. And we have these really bright highlights on this side of the table, so I'm not going to mess with those too much. There's a little bit of gray right here, and then these shadows kind of creep up just a little bit right there. And everything else, we're just going to kind of let it be. So I haven't touched any in this area. It's bright white. We want to keep it like that so it looks like it does in the picture. So right now I'm using the end of my tortillon, which works really well for like bigger surfaces. I really wouldn't want to waste the more refined tip of my tortillon with this. There's really no reason to. Now, other things to notice is there's a bright highlight here. It got covered up. So again, it's a lot easier if you just kind of let it be rather than go over it. But in some cases, sometimes that's not always possible. So we're just going to erase this back out. And so even with this highlight, it curves and then it kind of trails back this way. And it has a little bit of diffusion to it. So it's not sharp like this, like what we're seeing. It does have kind of like these, like almost like feathered type edges to it. So I'm going to take my tortillon and just along the edges kind of soften them a little bit. Now, we also have these grayer areas over here. I'm just going to use what is left on my tortillon for this. That way it's not too dark. And there's a little bit of shadow that kind of wraps around here, and then it fades out to like these brighter white highlights that we're seeing. So I'm trying to curve my tortillon as much as, or my shading that I'm doing here. So I'm going to try and curve that as much as possible. And again, because I use my tortillon, some things probably got a little soft and not as dark as they should be. So I can come back in, and where this shadow is a lot darker, I'm going to come back and make that dark again so it has that kind of dramatic lighting that's being conveyed in the picture. Same thing over here, there's these darker marks. And even with these marks, I'm going to just make them, and then I'm not really even going to blend them that much afterward. So what you're seeing in the table surface, there's a lot of like different reflections and kind of weird lights. Like there's a reflection cutting across here. You know, I can erase that out here in a second. And so this reflection mark is not nearly as bright as what this one is. So I just want to kind of keep that in mind. These kind of have like almost like a streak type look to it. And then we have a pretty bright reflection on this side. So this has kind of a curve like that. And there's a little highlight right here. And with these, you know, if you make them a little too wide, it's not a big deal. Just take your tortillon and you can kind of reshape how it should look. So looking at the rest of the can and the top of the can, you know, we have this kind of dark shadow that falls up here. So it kind of creates this curve. And again, I don't want to blur any of this out, so I just get my scrap piece of paper, put it on top. And as we mentioned, you know, we want a little bit of value over here. I'm going to erase these extra kind of placement lines or guidelines that we were working with originally. We can erase them from the letters. We don't need those anymore. And I'll probably want to clean up the top of the letters a little bit, where I was kind of like trying to get them to fit in my space. So I can come back through and just reshape this. And let's look at the sides of the can. So there are some like really bright areas, but again, I wouldn't even put any pencil down. I would really just kind of focus on using your tortillon for the kind of wider parts of the can. So there's a highlight here, there's another one here. So just using this, I'm going to just kind of skip some areas. So right now you can barely see any of the kind of grayish tone, which is good. And there are some like highlight streaks over here. So I can skip those, or even just come back in with my eraser and put those back in. So the key to this drawing is just kind of noticing all these like little subtle changes of light. Because if your drawing is really flat and gray without much changes, you know, if there isn't a lot of change in value, you know, the drawing isn't going to be very dynamic looking, nor is it going to have that kind of sense of realism to it, or the form, which is important because that's what we're focusing on, making things look three-dimensional. So right now, this area that I just did is maybe a little dark, specifically over here. So just kind of sweeping my eraser over it just a little bit to lighten it up. And I think I just had a little too much pencil on my tortillon. So that's where cleaning your tortillon can really help in terms of making sure you get those lighter tones. I'm going to erase this part out and then try to clean that up. And so thinking back to the Rubik's Cube, think about color darkness. So the blue is going to be pretty dark. So this wave, your text, the red, not as dark. You know, the blue is going to be pretty close to like how the black looks in the drawing or in the photo. So if I'm working with my letters, I'm just going straight up and down to help shape the P. I can come in with my tortillon and shape these better. And so if this is my blue value, my red needs to be lighter than the blue. So I'm going to work with the form still and curve these values I'm putting in. And I'm putting them in kind of light because I'm going to come back in and use my tortillon to smooth them out quite a bit. Now what you're also seeing, so again, these are not just like flat colors. So even in the red, there's a bunch of like just strange reflections and highlights. Like right here, there are what look like streaks of light. What the streaks of light are, it's actually the reflection from the studio lights, kind of similar to what we have in the classroom. So now I can take my tortillon. We're just going to try and soften this up. And remember, like, blending your pencil lines is a lot more successful if you kind of work in a circular motion. So like this, kind of breaks up all the lines and smears them together, which is for tonal shading, that's kind of your goal. So I would want to blend the letters too. Of course, you're going to want to use the sharper, more pointed side of your tortillon. And because the blue is darker, after I blend this, there's not much of a difference now. I can come back in with my pencil, just darken it up just a shade so that it does look like there is a difference in color. And then same for this bottom wave. This is going to have a darker value to it, so it should really match the lettering. If you're noticing also with the can, there's quite a bit of shading on this side. So I wouldn't want to just lay down pencil, but I can use my tortillon. And for this part, what I'm doing, I'm following the vertical line next to it, so I can just go up and down. Now, the line I showed you in the slideshow, where it kind of broke across here, but we didn't necessarily draw it, that's just important to know because there's a change in light. So right about here, it's darker, and then that's where you start to have some of these highlights, like this. There's another highlight here. And of course, we have this really dark shadow that we put in when we first started this part of the drawing. And again, if you get it a little too dark, you can come back and erase out your highlights if you need to. So like on the red right here, we have the kind of streaks of light. So we can put these in. And there's a really bright kind of hot spot here. It almost has like a triangular type shape. So I just took a little bit out, and then I can come back with my tortillon and kind of reshape that into what is seen in the photograph. And then we have some other like light reflections and changes. So there's this, and then it has a little curve. And like with these light reflections, they're pretty defined and sharp. So I can use my tortillon and just kind of like put a more defined line right there. With these, not necessarily, they kind of blend out more. So they're not quite as bright as what is seen on this side. And what we're saying with the photo over here is that there's a pretty strong light coming from this side of the drawing, and then there's another light kind of aiming down. So there are multiple light sources in this, and that's where you have those highlights. That's what you're seeing. You're seeing the source of the light, which is going to be important for all these drawings since we are working with value. And so we can continue the side here. And with this can, what you're also noticing is there is a bright highlight that runs along the edge, really close to that line, and where it starts, kind of starts midway in the words, and it goes down most of the side of the can. So I'm going to erase that out, and that's definitely too wide. So that's where I can use my tortillon and just kind of go back and bring this back. And we do have a darker shadow underneath, so it has more of a rounded appearance. So for this, I can even just kind of take my pencil and darken that. And this darker value will continue into the red part, which we would eventually add value to. And then with this red area, you know, it's going to have about the same level of darkness as what is up here. But do notice that it is brighter on the left side than it is on the right. And one thing to note here too is that there's this really dark outline. We don't see a dark outline in the photo. You just see a jump from what we would see as white to the red. So that's why we want to sketch really light, but because I was using that darker pencil, it kind of left that darker line. So I can just erase that line, and I should be able to get it to kind of blend in more seamless with the area that will become red. And then same goes for over here. We have kind of that dark line again that doesn't really exist. So avoiding outlines like this are important because they don't always happen or are visible. So with the remaining line that's there, I'm just going to kind of blend it into that dark shadow that's on the side. And so you would just continue these techniques for the rest of the can. With the background, there is really, it's just a lot of tonal shading. So for example, where we have kind of these pockets of darkness in the photo, I'm just going to set down my pencil. It's a little bit darker at the top. And then there's kind of this like break, and then it picks up really dark again here. And so with this background, it's going to be important to really use that kind of circular tortillon technique. My tortillon is starting to fall apart. Because you want it to look really soft and out of focus. And so by using these circular tortillon techniques, that will kind of help with that real soft kind of like blur and blending. Now, where we have the bright spots of light, so for example, there's one that just kind of hovers right above the can. You know, I maybe carried this value over a little too much. If you use one of your lighter pencils and then just kind of sketch these orbs of light that you're seeing. You know, these orbs of light, some of them are pretty bright, like this one is pretty bright. I think it's safe to say it's not going to be just the white of the paper, but it's going to have a bit of a shade to it. Starting to look kind of like a lemon for some reason. And then we have these orbs over here on the side, so they're a little bit higher up. So there's a smaller one that's overlapping another orb that is just a little bigger. And so with these two, for example, we can see that this one is a little bit darker than what this is. But then this one is also darker than what that is. So you have to just take these things into account when you are drawing. And if it helps you, take this image, convert it into black and white. Sometimes that can help you see and translate color like this. And then blend this, and we just need to make sure that it is not nearly as bright or not nearly as dark as the one underneath it. And these areas of light aren't perfect circles. They aren't perfect circles, and they're not necessarily like sharply defined either. So if I need to darken this one up, I can. And if you notice, these do overlap a little bit, and so there is kind of like a darker, almost like crescent type shape in this light orb. And the area around it, so this is kind of darker around this. So you just want to ensure that those areas are darker. And again, like let's say this got a little dark, a little too dark for what I was wanting. I can lighten it up just a little bit. And so in the end, as you're going through all of this, the background, you're not really going to see any dark, harsh lines. It's going to just be very soft with these kind of like jumps in value. And for a lot of things, if you notice, so for example, this kind of top highlight on the can in the photo, this top highlight only exists because the area around it is darker. So it's not necessarily the edge of the can that's defining it, it's the edge of the can that is reflecting light, and then it's the area around the can or the object that is defining its shape. So with these kind of darker outlines of the Pepsi can, especially like once we get to here, so if I put in this dark value, we have this highlight on the edge of the can, and so instead of like redrawing a harsh line, I don't need to. I can just have my area defined by the value next to that highlight. And so we don't really have a line here that's dark anymore. It's just the highlight of that line that's defining it. So again, just take note of small changes. It's a little bit darker at the bottom, and then it kind of fades lighter this way. And so, like with other dark areas we worked with, I'm just got a little bit more pencil. And then I can blend these. So just remember to use that kind of circular motion. So the table surface is kind of the same thing, where what we see in the photo, it's this bright highlight, but the bright highlight's defining the edge of the table, not a line that separates it. What does separate it is the darker values behind it. So once I have this done, we'll just say I finished all of it. I can still see some of the sketch lines here, but in the photo it's a pretty sharp, clear highlight that we're working with, I can just come back in and kind of erase some of that out. And that way we get that kind of edge of the table back. So all these different techniques that I showed you, you're going to use all these for this specific drawing, as well as a lot of your other drawings that you're working with for this class. That's all for now. We'll post another video when we are working with the next form for all the form drawings.